My name is Marta Halina. I'm one of the co-conveners of this conference, along with Henry Shevlin and Karina Vold. Thank you very, very much for coming. Welcome all of you. Some of you are here for the Varieties of Mind Conference that will continue over the next 3 days, and I'll do a welcome tomorrow for that. And some of you are here for the inaugural Margaret Boden lecture. Thank you for coming. We'll have 3 more public events over the next 3 days. You are all very welcome to come. We have 2 public debates, one tomorrow and the following day, and then on Friday another public lecture. So I just want to invite everyone for those. And they're all at 5:30 in this room. And now I will hand it over to Hugh Price to introduce Margaret Boden.
Thank you, Marta, and welcome everyone. I'm Hugh Price. I'm the academic director of the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence. And it's a very special pleasure for me to introduce this evening's speaker. 6 years ago this summer, along with Martin Rees and Jan Talen from Skype, I was one of the 3 co-founders of the Center for the Study of Existential Risk, or CSER. And when we announced our plans for CSER in the autumn of 2012, we attracted quite a bit of attention, some of it taking us more seriously than others. Terminator studies at Cambridge University, as the Daily Mail put it. But in amongst all that attention, welcome or otherwise, was a short letter expressing support that came to me from the University of Sussex. And when I opened it, to my delight and surprise, I found that it was from one of the world's most distinguished figures in AI and cognitive science, Professor Margaret Boden. I thanked Maggie for her letter and asked her if she'd be kind enough to join CSER's advisory board. And she's been one of our most valued supporters, first of CSER, and then more recently, since our launch 2 years ago, which she came to speak at, of the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence itself. Margaret Boden is Research Professor of Cognitive Science at Sussex, where she founded the world's first academic program in cognitive science. And in fact, when I was a young philosopher in Sydney, about 30 years ago, that program was already world famous. I knew of it, and that's, I think, when I first came across Maggie's name. Before moving to Sussex in the 1960s, she'd studied medicine and philosophy with great distinction in Cambridge, and psychology at Harvard. She's the author of many landmark books, most recently AI, Its Nature and Future. Earlier this year, CFI decided that we would like to mark Maggie's remarkable contribution both to the field and to our own much shorter history by establishing an annual lecture in her honor. And we're very pleased that Maggie agreed not only to this plan, but also to our suggestion that she herself be the inaugural Margaret Boden lecturer this evening. So please join me in welcoming Maggie back to Cambridge.
Okay. Well, thank you. There are some invitations you can't really turn down. No, I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted that you've established this lecture. Thank you very much. And I want to start out with a question that may arouse some memories of delight in some of you here. Is anybody here a fan of Henry James? Have any of you read his wonderful novella, The Beast in the Jungle? I know you have, because I recommended it to you many years ago. It's an extraordinary piece of writing. And I suppose I'm going to have to spoil it for you, but it is an extraordinary piece of writing, and I recommend it to everybody here. What it is a story of 2 young people, a man and a girl, wealthy New England wasps, of course, meet on the ship, go over to Europe, the Grand Tour, and on almost the first page, a puzzle is presented. And that puzzle is discussed by the two protagonists all the way through. And the puzzle is this, that the young man, ever since he was about 12 years old, had always believed that there was something special about him which marked him off from everybody else. He doesn't know what it is. He doesn't even know whether it's good or bad. And it seems a crazy thing to think, and so he's never told anybody about it. But this young woman, they click, and he tells her about it. And they discuss it all the way through. And half the way through the story is about 80 or 90 pages. She, who by this time is middle-aged and terminally ill, realizes what it is, but she doesn't tell him what it is. And on the penultimate page, the man, and indeed the reader, I'm spoiling it for you now, I'm afraid, discovers what it is. And what it is this, that for all of his attention to her and dutiful help over the years, all of which has been detailed in the preceding pages, he finally realizes that actually she didn't matter to him. Nobody mattered to him. Even she didn't matter to him. And of course that does absolutely cut him off from all of his human fellows. But it doesn't cut him off from computers, because computers don't care about anything. Nothing matters to computers. And in fact, it's a fundamental difference between human intelligence and the intelligence of AI that we care and computers don't. And what I'm going to try and do today is, in three sections, if you like, to talk about three implications of that difference, which I think are A, interesting in themselves, but B, relevant to how AI is going to play out in society in the future. And first of all, I'm going to talk about some examples of human-computer collaboration or synergy of the two sorts of intelligence. Then I'm going to talk about the notion of collaborating, humans collaborating with computers, and I'm going to argue that's a fantasy. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk about some areas in which perhaps we wouldn't want computers to go, we wouldn't want AI to go, although there'll be cultural differences there that I'll say a little bit about. Okay, so that's broadly what I'm going to be talking about. So first of all, let's talk about some synergy between human and artificial intelligence. I suppose the most obvious example is a whole host of examples, not just one example, is medical examples. I mean, there are already quite a number of AI systems which can diagnose various sorts of condition far better than even the best human pathologists. Some of these work by using machine learning, deep learning on literally many millions of bits of data, largely images, X-ray images, for example. And some of them are based not in that sort of machine learning, not in neural networks, but in symbolic AI and logic programming. There's a very interesting system called Credo, which has been in development now for well over 20 years, originally written by John Fox's team for the Imperial Cancer Research Fund. And that provides not only diagnoses, but also suggestions for treatment for many different sorts of cancer, and now also for ophthalmology, for cardiology, and so on. So these things already exist. They're already very useful. There is absolutely no question there will be many more of them. And in fact, I think it won't be too long. I don't know about giving you a date, but I wouldn't imagine it would be too long before you could be sued if you're a doctor or a hospital that didn't consult the particular AI system, which is known to be very efficient in a particular area of medicine. So the AI intelligence there has got a lot to offer. But it's interesting that the Wellcome Trust commissioned a poll from YouGov of what the public's attitudes were to this just a few months ago. And they found that in the UK, 45% of people were perfectly happy for AI to be involved in diagnosis. But only 21% of people said that they were happy for it to be used to suggest treatment. And in fact, a huge 64% of people said that they didn't want it to be involved in suggesting treatment. Now, that was the question they were asked: should it be involved in suggesting treatment? And maybe they took that language literally and didn't want it even to suggest treatment. Maybe some of those people thought they were being asked, do you want the AI to actually make the decisions about treatment? In which case I think 64% no would not be a surprising figure at all. Because certainly, and this is where the caring, non-caring difference comes in, it's one thing to say that AI can help us make medical diagnoses and can even suggest various sorts of treatment, and of course in many cases can give very detailed statistics about the length of the probability that you will live for so many years afterwards if you take this drug or if you take that drug, and what the side effects might be, etc., etc., etc. That's all, in my view, fine, and in the view of many people, according to this poll, fine. But what is not fine would be handing over the decision about what should be done, what drug, indeed, if any, should be taken to the system. I mean, that is a question that the human patient has to discuss with their doctor, possibly with their various members of their family, all sorts of things involved to do with the quality of life. Not just the length of life, the quality of life, and also the effect on other members of the family, whether they would have to be involved in caring, whether the children's inheritance would go down the spout, and so on and so on. All these sorts of issues, which are very important to human beings, and absolutely crucial, and can't be handed over to a computer system. Actually, surprising, well, it surprised me when I found it out recently, only in the past 25 years have human cancer professionals considered those sorts of issues in a sort of objective fashion, tried to have a systematic way of looking at those various issues and helping people to make decisions about cancer treatment. And in fact, I was shocked recently when a senior medic who was concerned with a study of ethics of AI in medicine actually described those sorts of issues to me as irrational. Not irrational at all, in my humble opinion, as they say in the emails. They are crucial, and crucial because they bear on all sorts of issues that matter to human beings and to the people involved. So those issues can't be handed over to the computer, even though the computer may well be asked, increasingly asked, to suggest certain treatments. So that's medicine. And of course there are all sorts of obvious sorts of facts that are relevant in medicine, which could in principle be communicated to the computer system, and which can be the basis of decisions or advice made by that system. But what about interpersonal domains? You might say, well, medicine, there's lots of physical facts there, but what about interpersonal domains and marriage counselling, for example? can you imagine having a computer system that could A, discover, and B, make any intelligent suggestions about facts there? Well, you won't be surprised to hear I think that's very, very much less likely. But there are some possibilities. Some of you, I'm sure, will remember the psychiatrist Ronnie Lang. Now, in the 70s, Ronnie Lang developed a very ingenious questionnaire. And it was meant to get at interpersonal perceptions in a family. And the reason was he thought that he had a theory of schizophrenia picked up from Gregory Bateson, which blamed the family, usually the mother, for miscommunications, which were said to be the basis of schizophrenia. But anyway, what was this questionnaire? It was a long list of questions, some of them trivial, like what's your favourite drink for breakfast? Some of them not so trivial, like what is your opinion of the Prime Minister? Do you believe in God? And so he would take the mother, let's say, he would give her this questionnaire and ask her to fill it in. She'd fill it in. Then he would give her a clean version of the questionnaire and say, please fill it in as your teenage son, let's assume he was the one that was apparently being possibly diagnosed with schizophrenia, as your teenage son would have filled it in. So she did that. Then he would give her a third clean sheet and say, now fill this in as your son would have filled it in for you. So she filled in the form 3 times. And of course the same was done with the son. So they had 6 answers to this questionnaire. And then the team would sit together and discuss these, because it very often happened that there were misperceptions there, which were arguably important anyway, and in many cases, B, not previously been realized. So there was some new knowledge coming out of that. And of course, Lang would discuss this with the people involved. Now, what's that got to do with marriage counselling? Well, as I understand it, I haven't actually been to a marriage counsellor, perhaps I should have. A marriage counsellor in general does not say, why don't you try this? More often they say, had you realised that he or she thought that? So they're exploring the perceptions, the shared perceptions, the misperceptions between the 2 spouses. And you can imagine having an AI app of some sort, which had questions on it, some trivial, some not, some of them possibly specially designed for marital situations, which could uncover this sort of thing. And now we're imagining an app here which, like Lang's original questionnaire, wasn't a question of box ticking, not a question of giving yes or no answers. So people could answer in ordinary sentences as they would if the thing was using speech recognition, for example. And then the idea would be that the system would use some sort of natural language processing to interpret the answers. Now, for example, it might use what's called sentiment analysis. Sentiment analysis is quite widely used for various purposes, and what it does is to look at a text and look at the statistics of the text, see if it can pick up negative or positive words. So the idea is to pick up the emotional tone, negative tone or positive tone of the text. So this is used, for example, by businessmen, by the police, by policymakers in various areas of government, trying to suss out what the public's view is and whether that public view is changing in various ways on particular issues of public interest. So you could certainly do that. And it might well be that, as I said, previously unrecognized misperceptions between the spouses were picked up by the system. It's not impossible. But you've got to be careful, because sentiment analysis is by no means fully reliable. Imagine, for instance, in our example, that the husband mentioned on various occasions within the interview that he said, my wife was raised in the Soviet Union, brought up in the Soviet Union. Now, I mean, if you had an ordinary common or garden sentiment analysis system looking at that, it would get coded positive, because the word union goes with affiliation of various sorts, and it would be marked positive. And the thing might even conclude that, you know, the husband was besotted with his wife, for you don't need marriage counselling at all. But in fact, of course, the husband might merely have been mentioning, completely neutrally, that his wife was raised in the Soviet Union because she had very un-English tastes in breakfast drinks, in politics, and in religion, which were the three examples of the three questions that I gave you. So if he had said my wife was raised in Russia, of course you wouldn't have had the problem. If he had said my wife was raised in the USSR, you wouldn't have that problem. But if he used the word union, then you could have that sort of problem. And that's an example of a very, very general point, that in general, natural language processing programs, which depend upon, if you like, statistical word clouds or sentiment analysis of the sort that I've described, they are, as I said, very often very useful, but they always need to be checked by a human being, because they can actually make mistakes which, once a human being looks at it, you can see, as in that example, immediately you can see what the mistake is and why it happened. So they couldn't be left to their own devices. Now you might say, it's pretty difficult to think of any example of an AI system used in a personal context which would be acceptable. Maybe, I don't know, a baby namer, an AI baby namer. I mean, many of us, I'm sure, in this room have gone out at some point and bought a book of baby names when we have a new baby and we're thinking about names. And so people might look for an AI app which would do the same thing, offer you baby names. Okay, well, imagine that you might think, you know, that's absolutely unproblematic. Nothing could go wrong there. Well, I don't know. Suppose you have a baby boy, a new baby boy, and you tell the thing that you want a name from the Bible, and for some reason, you want a name beginning with J. Would the thing be likely to veto the name Judas? I mean, it might well be, it might. It might be able to pick up the negativity attached to the name of Judas. Watson, for example, IBM's Watson program, which basically works on statistics of word clouds, among the many, many different sorts of literature or text it has in it is, on the one hand, the Bible, and on the other hand, the New York Times, which, of course, every year publishes lists of the most popular baby names. Okay. And Watson might well be able to pick up the negativity attached to Judas and to use that negativity to not suggest Judas as the name for the new baby. And actually, a human player of the game Jeopardy, which Watson was pitted against at one point and ended up, you know, outplaying both of the human champions in Jeopardy, he was asked, in effect, to name the two of Jesus' disciples whose names ended with the same letter, and whose names are in the top 10 baby names, or popular baby names. And he said, and actually, by the way, the answer, if you want to know it, is Matthew and Andrew. But he didn't think of Matthew and Andrew first. He said, my first thought was James and Judas. And then I thought, well, I don't know, I don't think that Judas is a popular baby name somehow, for some reason. Well, what reason? As I said, a Watson-type program might have picked up, indeed, that it wasn't a popular baby name, but why? It wouldn't know why. It probably wouldn't even be able to say that the concept of betrayal is very, very important here. And even if it was able to pick that up from the story and the remarks about Judas in the text that it was looking at, it wouldn't be able to say what's wrong with betrayal, why we despise betrayal, why we disapprove of Judas. Indeed, he disapproved himself and committed suicide because of it. He didn't even approve of it either. It's not behaviour that we approve of. But there is nothing in these sort of statistical approaches to natural language which could tell you that and which could bring that up. Now, actually, a very long time ago, a social psychologist called Robert Abelson wrote a very interesting computational analysis. It wasn't a program, but computational analysis of a number of psychological concepts, interpersonal concepts, which are very important to us, like love, cooperation, dominance, humiliation, and so on. And one of them was betrayal. And he analysed them in terms that were widely used in the AI of the time, and which we're going to be talking about a little bit in the next section, namely plans and goals and so on. And I'll just read you his definition of betrayal. Betrayal, he says, happens when actor F, having apparently agreed to serve as E's agent for action A, is for some reason so negatively disposed towards that role that he undertakes instead to subvert the action, preventing E from attaining his purpose. Now, if you think about that definition, you can see that it lays open systematically a number of different questions you could ask about distinctions between, for example, the relative strength of E and F and so forth, and the difference between abandonment and mere letting down, both of which are a form of betrayal, but of course, interestingly different. If you had an AI system with an understanding, and I say understanding in quotes here because, of course, even an AI system which is not just using statistics doesn't actually understand any of these concepts, but some of them can deal with them in ways that appear to be sensible and intelligent. A natural language program which had access to Abelson's definition of betrayal and other concepts could apparently enter into conversations and tell stories and ask questions about a number of issues, including the issue of why the name Judas is not a popular baby name. And it's got nothing to do with being a Christian. You don't have to be a Christian to not want to use the name Judas in its unabbreviated form anyway, for your baby. So, there could be such a system, but again, it wouldn't understand, it wouldn't share the contempt that we have for Judas because it wouldn't care about betrayal. Now, I said that the Abelson's account of betrayal and these other concepts that I mentioned depended on notions like goal and purpose and action and help and so forth. So that brings me to the second part of the talk, really, where I want to talk about the relationship between collaboration and human well-being. it's quite often said that we don't have to worry too much about future unemployment, because people, it's said, won't be losing their jobs, or many of them won't be losing their jobs. They'll be working happily alongside computers, collaborating with computers, using the strengths of the computers that the computers have, as I mentioned in the medical examples. And so that's fine. And I mean that when people say that, it's sort of comforting for people for two reasons. I mean, firstly, because it's saying, look, there isn't going to be such a massive job loss as some people fear. But secondly, because actually collaboration is valued for its own sake. We regard it as a good thing. We do. Cats don't. Remember Rudyard Kipling's cat? I am the cat who walks alone, and all places are alike to me. I will not come. Cats are not cooperative creatures, but we are. And so collaboration is warm and fuzzy. And if you think that AI systems have goals, and right from the start, many of them were described as having goals, and many of them still are, not the ones based on neural networks so much, but the ones based in symbolic AI of a more traditional type. They appear to have goals. Many of them appear to have goals. They can set future states which don't yet exist, and can work out ways of trying to arrive at those states, and they can vary their actions, variation of means, it's called, in doing that, and that's normally taken by philosophers and psychologists as a prime criterion of purpose. And they can be put to very, very good purpose. So, therefore, if AI systems, some of them, can have goals, and we can have goals, it looks as though there could be collaboration between goal-following AI systems and goal-following people, and that's fine. Well, there's a catch here, because, of course, the sense in which you can say that an AI system has goals is very different from the sense in which we have goals. They don't have intrinsic, what's sometimes called intrinsic motivation. They don't have their own goals. Admittedly, a goal, a particular goal, a specific goal that a certain system is following may have been generated by that system, not put in explicitly by a human programmer. That is true. But still, it isn't, in the sense in which our goals are our goals. It isn't a goal of the system. The system doesn't care about it. And if you were working together with it, working happily alongside computers, as we're told in this imaginary conversation, you wouldn't be able to share the success. You'd be drinking your champagne alone. You wouldn't be able to share the disappointments along the way, and so on. And actually that fact is relevant to the notion of unemployment, which is part of the reason why people started talking about this in the first place, to assuage people's fears about unemployment. The very first social psychological study of unemployment that was done in sort of 1929, 1930, in the Depression in Austria, it was done in a little village called Marion, where actually most of the people, a very large proportion of the people, were unemployed and had been for some time. And it found a number of very interesting things, which at the time were very surprising, but all of which have been confirmed over and over again in other countries at other times after that. And two things that were found was that both the effects and the causes of long-term unemployment are rather different from what you might think. You might think that the worst effect of unemployment is not being able to put food on the table, worrying about putting food on the table. And the people who talk about us, collaborating with computers in the future say, well, some of them say, well, that's all right, because there'll be some sort of financial engagement, universal basic income, UBI perhaps, which will actually put food on the table, so you don't have to worry about that. So that's all right. But this team, which was led by Marie Yehuda and Paul Lazarsfeld, this team found that the worst effect was not people's worries about where the next meal was coming from. It was a general lack of motivation, a general falling into apathy, so that I wouldn't say caring completely went away, of course not, but it got very much less important, less strong, less urgent, less motivating, and had very bad effects on people's lives. So that was the unexpected worst effect of unemployment that they discovered. And as for the causes, they found that, again, the most powerful cause of unhappiness in unemployment, again, was not worry about putting food on the table. It was the lack of certain sorts of things which we normally absolutely take for granted, and which we get largely from our employment. So including collaborating with other people, sharing a purposeful enterprise together, and other things like, time structuring and esteem and so forth. They even found what I call the Marion bubble. People today very often say, problem with social media, one of the problems with social media is that it encourages people to live inside a sort of self-contained bubble of people with only their opinions and preferences, which they come to think are the whole of reality, and don't come into contact with diversities of other opinions. And we've all heard that sort of thing, and I'm sure we've all been worried by it to a certain extent. Well, actually, Yehuda and Lazarsfeld found this sort of thing happening in Marienthal. I mean, the people in Marienthal, the unemployed people, weren't complaining about it. They weren't saying, oh, I miss my boss, he's always so horrible to me. But it was clear that they weren't coming into contact with the people they didn't like. They didn't have to come into contact with them because they didn't have to come into contact with them because they were there at work and they were there anyway. They didn't have to cope with them. And they were becoming, in general, less tolerant, less open to various sorts of diversity of opinion in other people and so forth, so that the team, the social psychologists doing this work, felt that they were losing out here, even though they themselves weren't complaining of losing out in that way. Okay. And of course, it's not just goal sharing that employment normally gives you. Another very, very old example, a few years later than the Marienthal one, mid-1930s, the industrial psychologist Elton Mayo did an extraordinary series of experiments at the Hawthorne telephone factory in America on productivity, and discovered that the workers' morale, and measured in terms of their actual productivity, not just what they said about whether they were happy or not, workers' morale could not only be affected in ways you might expect, like, for example, it goes up if you raise their wages, goes up if you give them more comfortable chairs, and so forth. He actually found that after having had a lot of those sorts of what you might call rational changes, dropping their wages led to a further increase in productivity, and lowering the lighting led to a further increase in productivity. And to cut a long story short, what Mayo concluded from this was that what was really important here, what was going on, what was really motivating the people, was the psychological context that they were in, whether they felt that the bosses were interested in them, whether they felt that they were valued, whether they felt that they were valued by their co-workers, etc., as well as whether they had some way of participating in the decisions that were being made about them. So all of these things were important. In other words, they weren't just concerned with the money, and they weren't just concerned with what you might call, decent working conditions, good lighting rather than bad lighting. They were concerned with the satisfaction of a wide variety of human needs. Now, what are needs? I think needs are things which a living organism requires for its survival, for which it will actively strive if the need is missing, and for which it will strive using mechanisms that have evolved over, in some cases, many, many millions of years, to enable it to satisfy those needs. And we'll come to examples in a moment. But so what is a need? And can AI say anything of any interest about needs? Well, somebody might say, yes, AI can, because, or at least linked to AI, they might mention the work of a physicist based in London, a man called Carl Friston. I'm sure some of you know about his stuff, but probably a lot of you don't. Carl Friston has defined this principle he calls the free energy principle. It's highly abstract, fiercely mathematical. It's based on Bayesian probability, and it's based on the notion that self-organizing systems, biological self-organizing systems, will tend to minimize entropy, or to put it in other words, will tend to resist tendencies to disorder. So this is a very abstract notion. And Friston quite explicitly says that this principle, I call it FEP for short, this principle is the basis of life, and it's the basis of mind. And it's how, he says, we should understand the brain, and it's how we should understand both life in general and psychology in particular. And many people in psychology and neuroscience have picked this up and are using it. And some people who are close to AI got at least several toes in AI. So it is increasingly popular among certain people in that community. And I think it's possible. I mean, I wouldn't claim to understand FEP. As I said, it's fiercely mathematical, and I don't understand it in detail. I certainly don't. And I suspect that a lot of people who talk about it don't either. It's possible, maybe, that if and when one of these days we understand at a much more fundamental level than we do now what a biological self-organizing living system is, and what needs are, what their relationship is to sustenance of life, it's possible that FEP or something like it will be part of that. It's quite possible. But at the moment, I don't think it helps us to understand either what needs are or what are our needs. And Friston himself admits, I mean, he admits as much. He says, FEP, he says it's a desert landscape in which many things that were previously visible have disappeared. And one of the things that disappeared is needs. I mean, he says at one point in one of his papers that joy is the resolution of uncertainty. And intrinsic motivation is the resolution of uncertainty. As I said, it's based in Bayesian probability, which deals with the prediction and resolution of uncertainty. Now, this certainly doesn't make any intuitive sense to me at the psychological level, and as I said, he admits that it doesn't to other people either. I think and it certainly can't help us to identify needs, to say, well, what are the needs that are important to us? And I think if you want to answer that question, and I'm afraid you have to go to something which is very, very much less rigorous, but much more intelligible, really based on folk psychology, to be fair. And that's what personality theorists say about what they take our needs to be. And I think the most helpful example here is Abraham Maslow. And I'm sure a lot of you know about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where he said that human beings have, well, initially he said 5 levels. He added 3 later, but never mind that. 5 levels of needs, which have to be satisfied if we're to live fulfilled lives. And the most basic ones are what he called biological needs, so food, sleep, warmth, sex. The second level up he called safety, security needs, including shelter and so on. But the next level up, the third level, was what he called love and belonging. Now that includes attachment, friendship, acceptance in a group, family relationships, relationships at work. He was quite explicit about, the issues that both Yehuda and Mayo had been talking about in terms of psychological satisfactions at work. That comes into love and belonging. The fourth level up was called esteem, and that included self-esteem, respect that other people have for you, human dignity, issues like that. And then the fifth was self-actualization. And as I said, he believed that for a wholly fulfilling human life, you needed to be satisfied at the 5th level of needs as well as all the others, but the further up that you could get, the better. And if you were stuck down at the bottom, then you would have a very unhappy life. Now, I'm not suggesting that those needs are well defined. They're not. As I say, they come from folk psychology. I'm not suggesting that there are clear criteria for counting or identifying needs. I'm not. And Maslow himself, as I said, added 3 more levels later on, so one could have lots of arguments about whether this or that need fits into this level or should be a separate level above. There are no really clear ways of answering that question, but I think that at an intuitive level, we have a much better, all of us, have a much better understanding, I think, of what's being talked about when Maslow is talking about this hierarchy of needs, than of anything like the free energy principle, which is to say is horrendously abstract and doesn't actually point to specific aspects of life like those. And the issue to do with collaboration here is that our goals are accepted because they are believed by us, directly or indirectly, to link to our needs, or to link to another goal, which is linked to a need. So the needs are the basis of all of our caring, and our goals are goals that we care for, that we commit to, because they're related to needs. And of course, whereas needs are actually biologically based, thought to be biologically based and therefore very widely shared, individual human beings, when everybody in this room, all of us have a whole host of individual idiosyncratic goals or intentions, which in some cases nobody else in the room shares, and the complexity of human cognition and motivation is such that that is possible. So that you can't say in general terms of any given intention, what need it's going to be attached to. We don't know. Imagine you're looking at a queue of men outside a baker's shop that's just opened, and they all want to buy a loaf of rye bread. They all have the intention, the goal of buying a loaf of rye bread. Now, why? What are the needs involved? Well, the first man in the queue might be hungry. Second man in the queue might want to raise his social status by making cucumber sandwiches for Lady Bracknell. Third man in the queue might be, painting a still life. On Sundays, he's a Sunday artist, and he wants to have a loaf of bread in his still life. The next one in the queue might have noticed a very beautiful, but apparently starving young girl around the corner, so he's going to buy a loaf of bread and give it to her. The next one might have known might have heard that there's a ergo poisoning rumour in the district, and he wants to carry out a scientific test to find out whether that's right. Next one might want a loaf to use in a religious rite like the Eucharist. I mean, you name it. Any need on Abraham Maslow's list that you care to pick, and any combination of, for that matter, any need you care to pick, you can make up a story which could be the basis of an intention in a complex human mind, and we're perfectly aware of that. So goals are absolutely crucially linked to needs, and because needs, as I've defined them, are aspects of life, aspects of the survival of life, they're not something, I would say, that computers can have. They're not something that AI is equipped to deal with. It isn't about needs. You might say, well, systems can prioritize goals. Well, in a sense, yes, and there are some quite interesting examples of that. But again, the prioritizing is not a matter of caring, not a matter of commitment on the part of the system. And the system does not really have goals in the sense that we do, because there is no caring or commitment there. They're not really goals, and therefore there can be no real collaboration. Now, you might say, well, what about Stephen Omohundru? Stephen Omohundru is an AI professional who has queried this. I mean, he doesn't actually talk about needs. He uses the word drives, but I think it's fair to say I think he's looking at much the same issue. And he says we really need to, and he's one of the people who's worried by the possibilities of the singularity and so on and so forth. And he says, look, if we do build really human level, never mind superhuman level AI, it will have drives, and some of those drives could be very dangerous for us. Now, for example, he said, such a system would resist being turned off. That's one drive that it would have. Another drive it would have, he says, is it would try to gather resources, as many resources, whatever resources those were, as far as possible. Another drive, he insists it would have, would be to copy itself. And he says, and this is a quote, he says that those drives would develop because of, quotes, the intrinsic nature of goal-driven systems. In other words, not a question of us, programming it in, having to program it in. We wouldn't have to, according to him. It's just because of the intrinsic nature of goal-driven systems. But then, see, I would say to that, he's begging the question there. He's begging the question that I've been raising here. He's assuming that these are intrinsically goal-driven systems, in the sense in which we are. I've been arguing that they are not, and that particular worry on the part of some people thinking about the singularity is actually not something we need to be worried about, because there is no reason to think that these systems, if we produce them, will develop drives of that sort. Now, just a little bit about the last question about the caring, non-caring difference, whether that makes any problems for applying AI in certain areas of human society. A very, very sad, very important, I think, but very sad study was done recently on 69, people looked at 69 care homes for elderly people in the UK. And they found, to cut a long story short, that for people with incipient and moderate dementia, many of those people had an average of 2 minutes personal interaction per day. Because their human carers, for example, who brought them their lunch, didn't have time to sit down and make sure that they ate it or talk to them about it and so on. They were, in effect, in solitary confinement, which is, the worst thing that a prison governor can do. It wants to punish a prisoner. And in this study, I don't know whether they did this in every single one of those 69 homes. I don't remember now. But anyway, in many of them, they instituted a system where they used specially trained people, first of all, to discuss with every patient in the home, or every resident in the home, discuss what interested them. And what they felt they needed, what they were interested in, what their goals were, and so on and so on. And on the basis of that discussion, which may have gone on for a couple of hours, they actually worked out a structured series of activities which could be shared with that resident, okay, and which spoke to those needs, those interests. And then, having done that for every resident, then they made sure that every week, every resident got 1 hour of shared collaborative activity for that particular resident's program. Only 1 hour a week. And they found a staggering improvement in the people's well-being. The wandering, the depression, the aggressiveness, the various measures of dementia and of the ill effects of dementia went down hugely. Only 1 hour a week. Now that's something which can only be done by human beings. It's obviously something which is honing in on the needs and interests, the sorts of things that Maslow was talking about, couldn't be done by an AI program. Now, I'm not saying that an AI system couldn't help people with dementia. Absolutely no question that it could. And there is one very well-known example, I'm sure many of you will have heard of it, little baby seal thing, sort of robot, looks like a baby seal, called Paro, which has been used in old people's homes and in hospitals all over the world now, and has similar effects, calming effects on people. Absolutely no question about it. And in fact, NASA at the moment apparently is considering providing Paro for its astronauts when they go to Mars. They're going to have a long journey to Mars. There's a lot of stress involved, right? They're considering whether or not they should provide this little thing to help reduce the stress in the astronauts. Now, of course, the astronauts do not suffer from dementia, and a lot of people in old people's homes don't suffer from dementia. And those people, if they're going to have any such thing, would require some fairly fancy natural language processing. I mean, Paro itself doesn't yet use language. It can learn its name and so on, and a couple of words about it, sort of bad boy and good boy, but it uses, when it vocalizes, it uses seal squeaks recorded from real seals, and so it doesn't have language. But of course, Alexa and Siri and things like this, which are now entering people's houses and on their phones, they do use language of a more complex sort. And many people working to develop so-called computer carers to be used in old people's homes, and for the matter, in people's own homes, if they're living by themselves, are using that sort of natural language processing and saying that it will be possible to have conversations for people in old people's homes who are lonely and never visited by their relatives, to have conversations with these things and to share their memories, and the thing might even be able to collect those memories without being bored, of course, by being told the same story over and over again, as some of the relatives would, and put it into a journal which could then be given to the relatives as a memoir. Think about it. Would you want your precious memories, all of them, to be made open to your children? Think about it. Anyway, I think there's lots of dangers there. And, well, now many years ago, in the early days of AI, when some people were starting to talk about using AI to help judges, for example. John McCarthy was talking about using AI to help judges make decisions of various sorts. A computer scientist at MIT called Joseph Weizenbaum, made the whole AI community absolutely furious by writing a book called Computer Power and Human Reason, in which he said, and I'll quote, he said, "To substitute a computer system for a human function that involves interpersonal respect, understanding, and love," note those Maslow terms, respect, understanding, and love, is simply obscene. I actually agree with him. Maybe many of you do too. And in fact, in an Ipsos Mori poll recently, it was found that even the UK's digital natives, 18 to 29-year-olds, are unhappy about using AI systems in these sorts of interpersonal contexts. But that's the UK. In Japan, things are very, very different. The attitude to robots in Japan is very, very different, as some people here know far better than I do and can perhaps tell us about. I mean, just for example, if you look up the website of Japan's Artificial Intelligence Society, and you look for the section called Ethical Guidelines, the last in the list of ethical guidelines talks about developing robots to be, quotes, members or quasi-members of society. And a great deal of money and advertising of various sorts is being put in at the Prime Minister's on the Prime Minister's authority to trying to persuade people in Japan to use robot carers for their elderly people, to use robot carers to help nurse people in hospital, to use robot carers in families, and indeed to use them as companions, not just as helpers, as companions, and to use them above non-Japanese human beings. It's very widely accepted by some people in Japan, and if you read some of the things that the Prime Minister has said about it, he's said things which absolutely would not resonate well in the West, I think. about the sorts of relationships that he sees as being A, possible, B, desirable between robots and human beings in ordinary families. It's a very, very different attitude indeed. And I'd just like to tell you an anecdote. I can't remember where I heard this, I'm afraid, but anyway, it struck me at the time, and I think it's relevant here. An anecdote about a paraplegic in England, a paraplegic, who had to be turned in bed quite often. And sometimes this was done by a robot with human help guiding it, but sometimes it was done perfectly smoothly and efficiently by a robot, and sometimes it was done by a member of staff. And one of the members of staff was actually grumpy, rough, and sometimes caused hurt and even bruising to the paraplegic concerned. But he said that he would prefer to be turned by that member of staff than by the robot, which he was perfectly sure wouldn't hurt him. So the question is, was he being irrational or not? And would your views on that be different from your Japanese friends' views on that? So just to finish, there have been, because of this huge upsurge of interest in AI that there's been recently, there have been at least 8 or 10 reports already, official reports brought out by various governments, by various institutions, both in this country and abroad. And most of them talk in some way about human well-being, using AI for human well-being. But very often, that's very abstract. For instance, the IEEE, Institute of Electronic and Electrical Engineers, in their report, human well-being comes down to concern for privacy, concern for human rights as accepted United Nations, and privacy and human rights very often come up. So the best of those reports that I've read so far is the one produced actually by the House of Lords with the help of some people here. I think it's an excellent report, but it doesn't actually discuss psychology in general, doesn't discuss psychological well-being in general. The report come out from jointly from the British Academy and the Royal Society, which looks at first sight as though it's going to, because it says that human flourishing is going to be the core principle, and it even says that we want to identify, and this is a quote, core human purposes or goals, which of course is exactly what Maslow was trying to do. But when you actually read further, what it's actually talking about is not the sorts of issues that Maslow was talking about, but the sorts of issues that development economics talks about. What Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum call capabilities. So things like the ability to vote, the ability to travel, the ability to have changes that are sustainable and not harmful to the environment and so forth. And all of which are very important and of course much more easily measurable than the sorts of things I've been talking about, but they're more sociological than personal. And I think it's very important that for the future of AI in society, we shouldn't forget those personal issues. They're not trivialities, they're not optional extras, they're hugely important. These things matter. We are human beings and we can't do without them. Without those things, we don't flourish, we cannot get on. And we need to, on the one hand, make sure that they aren't neglected and AI put in their place, as Weizenbaum said. I think that's obscene. But also that society in general, including the workplace, insofar as people are still going to have workplaces, leaves room for them and deliberately makes room for them So I think we should all be concerned, including the politicians, because these things do matter.
Thank you very much, Maggie. We now have 3 short responses to Maggie's talk. I'll introduce our respondents and then leave it up to them which order they want to speak in. So from the left here we have Jude Brown from Polis and Gender Studies, Jose Hernandez Horayo from the Polytechnica University in Valencia, who's been visiting CFI this academic year, and Henry Shevlin, also from CFI, who's one of the organizers of this wonderful conference. Which of the 3 of you would like to go first?
Thank you very much indeed for such a fascinating paper. And really, what I'm going to say to you emanates from your paper rather than as a commentary on it. So I'm completely persuaded by your concerns that we shouldn't delude ourselves that robots and AI systems could care or can develop independent values or could strive towards what they perceive as needs, fulfilling needs, at least not in the sense that we would mean it. And bearing this in mind, I wanted to move to a question of liabilities. I think it very much chimes with what you were saying. And in particular, I wanted to ask you about the e-personality, which is a liability model recently mooted by the European Parliament, whereby AI systems with sufficiently autonomous capabilities could be insured individually and held liable for any harm or damage that they inflict, thereby shifting legal liability away from manufacturers and designers after a certain point of development. And so the e-personality model of liability would be something similar to the personhood status accorded to some corporations in the US. And we can imagine thinking about your talk about care bots and medical bots, like the ones you described in the Japanese context, or maybe transport bots, where the e-personality legal status would have a great deal of impact should the technology become that advanced. So I'm guessing from your paper that you'd be against this sort of legal move. And so my question is one about regulation in the UK context. And I think we have to kind of bear in mind the sort of gold rush mentality of governments and corporations across the world. All of them, understandably, are keen to innovate and to compete with each other. And as you pointed out in your paper, there's a great deal to commend AI. There's a lot of excitement about the possibilities that it can bring human flourishing. But we also saw the downsides, and this liability model is a key aspect of that. And so my question is, how much regulatory intervention would you like to see at this stage in the UK, and what might it look like?
Maggie, I'm going to suggest that you hold your answer to that question in the interests of timing, and we'll have comments from Jose and Henry first, and then give you time to respond to all 3.
Thank you for the lecture. And this is refreshing because we've heard a lot about recently about values and also emotions in AI and many other things that AI lacks. But I think this talking about care as something that is different and also it's affecting the interaction between AI and humans. I think this is refreshing. I'm going to push this a little bit to the extreme. So as usual, to see whether it breaks somewhere and also raises some questions or well, this is not, I guess it's not set as a solution to AI. And my question is going to be around that. So the first thing is perhaps we are a little bit idealistic about humans sometimes. When we say humans care, well, we don't care about our job, our boss. We don't care. For some professionals, carers, if they're not well paid, they don't really care about the person they are caring for. And so sometimes we have this fake care from humans, and this is very, very common. So saying that humans care, well, we have the capability, and we have to educate people for caring, and we have something inside that makes us. But sometimes we are a little bit idealistic, and there are interests and many things around that. So one of the questions is, and related to AI next, is should we consider, for instance, when we have a misalignment between needs and cares for people, or maybe when these things such as interests, should we consider that a feature or a bug of humans? And whether it is a feature, we will put that into machines. If it is a bug, we wouldn't like to put that into machines. So basically the question is about trust. Because if we think that some of the expressions of care from humans are fake, we can also think that, well, we are putting into machines, and that's what we're doing because we don't understand the process. We try to put a kind of a fake care into these machines, some of the examples you have mentioned. So one of the questions is, in the same way we can have organizations, I think David Runciman has given several talks about this, and organizations don't care, states don't care. So we have all of these things already. So it's not that really AI. So when we have these companies saying, because we care. So this is fake care, of course. So the question, and I just finished with this, is do you think that the AI systems of the future, we should, or it is preferable that we shy away from fake care, trying to avoid to put this into machines at all, and just stick to the fully rational, non-pretending AI systems that they don't really try to do more just to fake this care, so that they are a little bit more trustable because they don't try to do this. So that's basically the main question.
Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. One of the things I really took from it was this idea that we can draw a line between, on the one hand, creatures like us who strive, for whom there are things that matter, who care about themselves and about one another, and creatures or systems that don't have those capacities. And just to explore that distinction a little bit more, I'm really interested to hear how you think we should place animals and different animals on that spectrum. So on the face of it, we have all sorts of productive relationships with animals, including collaborative relationships. Think of examples like farmers and sheepdogs, for example, and also companionate relationships with people have with dogs, cats, even reptiles. And it might seem like really we're dealing with creatures that have these capacities, or at least many of them have these capacities. But I also worry that if we set the bar too high in cognitive terms for having these kinds of capacities, if we require that creatures be able to articulate reasons, or even just consciously consider the reasons why they're acting, then it's going to leave a lot of these quite meaningful relationships looking ersatz, looking fake. I mean, a sheepdog has no idea why a farmer is keeping sheep in the first place. But I want to say, or at least I think I'm inclined to say, that that doesn't get in the way of that being a truly valuable form of collaboration. So my broader worry here is that in the rush to distinguish ourselves from AI systems and find things that make us human and distinguish us from them, that we might end up shortchanging animals, or at least some animals. More optimistically, though, I would suggest that perhaps via attending to the qualities, and particularly the cognitive dimensions, that do make some animals, able to form relationships with us, the kinds of things we can collaborate with, that might ultimately inform ways in which we can generate genuine forms of social interaction and genuine forms of meaning in interactions with artificial intelligences.
Thank you. Maggie, would you like to respond?
Yeah, three very interesting sets of questions. The first one, Jude, I mean, I think it's nonsense to ascribe liability to an AI system, whether it's an on-screen system or whether it's a robot, doesn't make any difference. I think it's nonsense. But one of the things I didn't say when I was talking about Japan is that in Japan, for some years now, a number of robots, and apparently in Japan, a humanoid or animal-like robot normally has a name, so there can be individual, this robot has his name, it's not just a class of robots. a number of robots have been officially given a certificate of residency in a particular part of Japan, which is virtually impossible for a non-Japanese person to get hold of, even if they are a permanent resident in Japan. And they have been made, some have been declared officially a family member, where that is a much more sort of legally important notion in Japan, or what they mean by family, than it is in our country. So obviously, they must think that there is no contradiction here, that there is no absurdity here. I just can't see it. I think this is one of these cases where the basic metaphysics, I mean, as I understand it, which is not very far at all, I'm very, very ignorant about Japanese philosophy, but insofar as I understand it, their Shintoistic tradition doesn't make a strong metaphysical distinction between living and non-living things, for example. This is why it is so much easier for them to include robots in, the whole sort of nexus of relationships between living and non-living things. This is why they don't object, quite the reverse, when they have funerals, when Buddhist temples put on funerals for robots. Now, it's true that on at least two occasions in the Iraq War, the American forces held funeral services for one of the robots that had actually saved lots of lives. But, I really wonder to what extent those funeral services were held, if you like, in good faith. That's A. B, it certainly is the case that some of the compatriots, other United States servicemen, who were no doubt equally glad that people's lives had been saved by these things, were upset by their having those things. So I think there are fundamental conceptual philosophical differences here which make certain sorts of conceptual relationship relatively easy for one culture to accept and relatively impossible for another culture to accept. I, as I say, cannot accept that you can truly give liability to one of these things. I think it's people trying to avoid their own responsibilities. A corporation doesn't care in the way in which even a managing director cares, but I mean somebody, whether it's the directors or whether it's the shareholders, somebody at some point is going to have to pay. They're trying to avoid that. I think that's what's going on here. They're trying to avoid it. So I think it's a cynical nonsense. That would be my answer on that. For Jose, of course you're quite right. We very often overdo the caringness of human beings, and the people that I mentioned in old people's homes who are getting an average of 2 minutes a day of human contact, they wouldn't be in that situation if A, their friends and relatives, who admittedly might be in some cases dead, but A, if those people visited, but B, even more importantly, if you like, if the people who were working in their care homes were respected and paid reasonable wages for doing a hugely important job. And one of the things that I hope will happen as a result of advances in AI is that those aspects of humanity will become more valued, and more valued in general, and also more financially valued, however that's done, however that's handled, than they are now. That could happen, and I think it's something we should try and push forward. Whether that'll work, I don't know. So I entirely agree with you about that. You're talking about perhaps we should just go for the fully rational AI systems that aren't pretending. Well, see, we aren't fully rational. The stuff from the Marion study, the stuff from Elton Mayo, we are not fully rational. We would not be happy if we were fully rational. So no, I don't think that we should, or at least if we go for fully rational AI systems so that nobody is deceived, I mean, if that's what you're saying, okay, I have no problems with that. But we shouldn't kid ourselves that fully rational AI systems can stand in for largely, well, I don't want to use the word irrational, but I mean non-rational. There are other aspects to human life and well-being than rationality and than instrumental goals and values. And that's just, you know, what we are, and I think it's a good thing about what we are. Well, that has its bad side too, of course. You don't have AI axe murderers. So I don't think that solves the problem. And as for Henry, I think you're absolutely right. Yes, animals care. Animals have needs. I mean, they're, you know, and yes, there are genuine relationships. In some cases, you could even call it collaboration, like the sheepdog cases, one example, between human beings and some animals. Yes, and of course, in hospitals and old people's homes, as well as these paro robot things that I talked about, sometimes people use so-called therapy dogs, or sometimes cats, but mostly dogs, and, you know, go around and visit and so forth, and have a measurable and perfectly clear, undeniably good effect on the people. And it's entirely possible, I wouldn't be at all surprised, if they have a better effect than paro does, because they're living creatures that you can have some sort of empathy with and so on, and they respond in a way. Well, I mean, paro responds, but it doesn't really respond. So I entirely agree with you about that. And that gets into, you know, well, all sorts of issues I'm sure we'll be talking about over the next few days about, you know, just what one can say about various animals. But of course, there are many animals for which I would want to say they have needs, because they're living things. But I wouldn't want to say that, you know, I wouldn't want to anthropomorphize them. I mean, not even mammals or birds. You know, if you go further down you go, the more difficult it gets. And what's the other thing? Oh, yes, and I certainly wouldn't want to say that in order to talk about caring, or in order to talk about collaboration with a human being has to be engaging with an animal that, as you said, you know, can think consciously about the reasons for which it's doing something. No, it's not required, it's not necessary. And of course, a human baby can't either.
Thank you, Maggie. Now, I'm afraid that we're very nearly out of time. I'm sure that a lot of you have questions. What I'm going to do is call for a show of hands, but please only put your hand up if you can ask your question in 30 seconds. And we'll take 2 or 3 of those and ask Maggie to respond to them. And I'm afraid that's all we have time for. So, do we have any 30-second questions? One there, Susan, and one here. Let's just keep it at those 2. Thank you. Would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. So my question is about when you were talking. Okay, so you're talking about how AI can't necessarily simulate, and maybe it shouldn't simulate particular affective roles that human beings have. And then it seemed to me you were talking about at least two types of affective activity, right? So one is the kind of caring activity someone might do is working in a care home. And the other, you were talking about kind of decision-making by doctors and lawyers, and you gave the example of the judge. And I just wondered whether, I mean, this isn't like a sort of, are you familiar with this work? But I know, for example, Antonio Damasio has done experiments where he's found that patients that have been brain damaged in particular regions of the brain, I can't tell you, I'm not a scientist, can't tell off the top of my head. They're very good at going through, say they're making a decision, they go through all the rational kind of reasons and the rational processes and the, you know, counter arguments and the counterfactual situations, but they can't actually make the decision because the bit of their brain that, let's say, processes or generates certain types of affect has been damaged. So I wonder if that was a kind of useful way of thinking about some of what you're talking about, the more advanced affective.
Thank you very much. And your question, sir? There's a microphone coming to you.
Hi, I was wondering, what do you think about utility functions with regards to caring? There's a lot of, in particular, Alejandro's paper talks about AI drives in terms of utility functions. So yeah, basically, what do you think about those with regards to cares? If that's how we model what AI wants and things.
Okay,
I think I would say the same about AI as I would say about economists. Economists who think only about utility functions as traditionally defined are leaving a lot out. And Elton Mayo's stuff showed that. So utility functions aren't enough. Or you've got to define new sorts of utility function which takes these other issues into account. As for the latest question over here, yes, you're quite right, of course, that people's intelligence, and in particular the choice of goals and the following of goals, does depend to a much greater degree than we realized, say, 20, 30 years ago, on emotional factors. And there's actually some very interesting work in AI done by a man called Aaron Sloman on the simulation of anxiety and the way in which different goals and different purposes are prioritized at different points, and which teaches a lot about human anxiety. And the example he has in mind, and which he is simulating in his computer model, is a nursemaid who's in charge of a dozen babies and has about 7 different things she has to do. She has to feed them, she has to keep them safe. You know, about 7 different things that she has to do, some of which, when they arise at all, are absolutely urgent, got to be done at once, like saving the baby from falling into a river or going under the wheels of a lorry that's coming along the street. Others of which are hugely important and have to be attended to at some point, but not necessarily now. And of course that includes feeding even of the most hungry baby. But of course we all saw, well, fortunately for us we didn't see, but we saw photographs of most appalling things that happened in those orphanages in Romania when they were opened up, when again, you know, the people working in the orphanages hadn't had time to talk to the babies, the children. Even worse than the situation I described in the old people's home. And they were permanently, horrendously, psychologically damaged by this. So yes, and AI, and in that particular study I think is extremely interesting, and it teaches us a lot about what anxiety is in human beings and how it helps us to follow our goals and get the right things done, you know, in the right circumstances. But that's not at all the same thing as saying that that system or any other AI system actually has anxiety. It does not. But it is a very interesting and illuminating model of real anxiety in human beings.
Thank you very much, Maggie. And apologies to those of you who would have liked to ask questions. I hope many of you will also be attending the rest of this conference. We have an extraordinary program over the next 3 days, and perhaps you'll have an opportunity to speak to Maggie during that period. But for the moment, I'd just like to ask you to join me in thanking both Maggie and our 3 excellent panelists.